The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is expanding. We will take a look at the SCO Summit and the impact on the new world order. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is the world's largest regional bloc, covering approximately 60% of the area of Eurasia, 40% of the world population, and more than 30% of global GDP. The group finished its annual meeting, this time hosted in Uzbekistan, with many agreements and bilateral talks. Aljosa Milenkovic has details from Samarkand.
The 22nd SCO Summit has concluded in the Uzbekistan city of Samarkand. In opening the plenary session, the president of the host country, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, described this summit as a historic one that will define the future of this organization. In summarizing the summit's progress, it should be said that over 40 documents were signed. A lot of bilateral and multilateral agreements were reached. As the first day of the summit was dedicated to bilateral meetings, the second was focused on the joint sessions. At the plenary, all 15 heads of state sat together at the round table with the representatives of candidate and new partner countries. It was the first time that Iran participated as a full member country, and Belarus became the candidate for full member status. Several other countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, moved to become partner countries. After the televised plenary session, the SCO leaders signed the Samarkand Declaration, outlining the goals and directions for the organization over the next year. As the summit ended, India assumed the presidency of the organization, setting a course for its first hosting of the next SCO Summit. Aljosa Milenkovic, CGTN, Samarkand.
To discuss the importance of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, let's bring in our panelists. Here in Washington, D.C., Sourabh Gupta is Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. From Moscow, Dmitry Babich is a journalist and political analyst. Einar Tangen is a Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. He joins us from Beijing. And here in Washington, Chidanand Rajghatta is Foreign Editor and U.S. Bureau Chief of the Times of India. Welcome to all of you. Sourabh Gupta, let me start with you. You know, as I said, the SCO is the world's largest regional organization. It represents something like 30% of world GDP, but it is not an organization that is well known in the Western world. Not many people have heard of it. I mean, is it a defense alliance like NATO, or is it some kind of an economic grouping like the EU? I mean, we do know that there have been military exercises, joint military exercises conducted by members, but that's been, the focus has been on countering terrorism. So how would you describe the SCO?
I would call it primarily a political organization, or maybe even a political security organization, which is now building in a very broad economic portfolio. What we need to understand a few things about Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's not a bloc-based organization. It's not bloc against bloc. It's not an alliance or a collective security organization. So in that case, in that sense, one needs to understand it's not something like NATO. The collective security organization is the CSTO in Central Asia, which is led by Russia and does not include China. But the important point to note is that the SCO was born at a time when there was the evils of terrorism, separatism were felt at that point of time in Central Asia. Much of that has been controlled. SCO was a kind of a defensive mechanism to ensure that these did not radiate and spill across borders. So while that element, the anti-terror control element, still exists, the SCO is trying to pivot away from not just its Shanghai spirit, but what I would call its Samarkand spirit in Uzbekistan, where it starts taking a more positive view of the economic exchanges and the connectivity corridors that can be how the organization frames itself. Mm-hmm. And as we've seen, there are many civilization spaces which are now wanting to become and join the SCO. It's becoming a pole of attraction in a way and allowing for a dialogue of civilizations, a mini United Nations, as you will. So it is pretty broad-based. It's not military-based, and it's trying to become a political, economic, multilateral organization that is geographically concentrated at the heart of Eurasia.
So, Sourabh, as you say, it's not a bloc, but in terms of the mechanics of how it operates, I mean, how does it coordinate its decisions, its political decisions? And I mean, does it have a secretariat, for instance?
Yes, it does have a secretariat. The secretariat is a small one, and it's got two secretariats actually. The legacy secretariat is the one which was with regard to terrorism. It's called the Regional Anti-Terror Mechanism, the RATS. The system is called RATS, and that's what many of the exercises, the military exercises that it does are geared towards. But beyond that, yes, there is a secretariat. But as I would like to, emphasize, we have the Chinese civilization, Russian civilization, South Asian civilizations, that's the Indian civilization. We got the Turkic civilization, the Persians coming in, and even the Arabs wanting to join. So from that geographic locus of Central Asia and Eurasia, it's radiating outwards, but it's not an exclusionary one, but it's more a geographically centered block of nations, grouping of countries.
And at Tangen, of course, President Xi Jinping of China is at the summit. This is his first foreign trip since the outbreak of the pandemic. And he visited Kazakhstan, and then, of course, the summit took place in Uzbekistan. How significant is that the president chose these two countries, and specifically the SCO Summit, to make his first foreign trip?
I think it's very significant because it really means that China is thinking in terms of its region at a time when globally the U.S. is putting a tremendous amount of pressure on China. It's trying to shore up its neighbors, and this is putting this as a priority, very important. And let's also talk about the significance of going to Kazakhstan first and declaring that China is very interested in making sure territorial integrity is respected. This was a very important first note as he was on his way to the SCO, and it really kind of reflects this kind of global security initiative that he's been proposed for the last year. And I think they're, in essence, trying to flesh that out. How do you go forward in a world that has a lot of challenges and where you have people, countries who are at loggerheads? I mean, what's unique about this particular organization is that it has countries that have good relations. I mean, India and China have issues. Obviously, Pakistan and India have issues. There have been issues amongst members where there's actually armed conflict going on. So, it's a talk shop, but beyond that, it wants to adopt a set of principles where countries can respect each other's territory, also while fighting off terrorism, separatism, and extremism.
Dmitry Babich, President Putin has been at the summit as well. Now, Russia, of course, is facing very harsh sanctions because of the conflict in Ukraine. Russia's allies in the global south and in the SCO, for that matter, are calling for an end to this conflict in Ukraine. In fact, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Putin in a face-to-face meeting that today's era is not an era of war. How is that being seen at the Kremlin?
Well, I don't know so much about the Kremlin, but in Russia, basically we agree, and I think President Putin also agrees. We all want this conflict to end as soon as possible. The problem is that the Ukrainian government has stopped peace talks, which were going pretty successfully in the end of March, as you probably remember, in Istanbul. Russia even withdrew its troops from the area near Kiev in the framework of these talks. And then President Zelensky and his entourage, they felt like the military luck was on their side, and they said that they would continue until they win this war. And unfortunately, they were supported by, for example, the head of European diplomacy, Mr. Barroso, who said, I quote, "The fate of this war will be decided on the battleground." So basically, if you listen well to the speeches at this SCO summit, and also please note that before the SCO summit, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping visited Kazakhstan. Speeches were also against the sanctions, because sanctions imposed on Russia and on many other members of SCO, they are also a form of war, which the United States and the EU had been practicing long before this new escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. I stress it, escalation, because the war in Ukraine started not in 2022, but in 2014, when the United States and the EU supported the illegal, violent ousting from power of President Yanukovych. So in Russia, this summit is viewed very positively. The impression that the people have, that the public has, is that it's laughable to say that Russia is isolated. Let me remind you that Russia was, basically, there were two founding members of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was China and it was Russia, and also Central Asian states joined. It was back in the late 90s, but the organization came, at its present form, it came to light in 2001. But the initial summits were on the territory of the former Soviet Union. Also, I remember some of them were on the territory of Russia. And the impression that Russians get from it is that it's not that we are isolated from the West. The West is isolating itself from the wider world. And it was very well felt and pronounced at this summit meeting in Samarkand.
Chidanand, Rajghatta, India, of course, is part of the SCO. And let's look at India's position. It's part of the SCO, but it's also part of another organization called the Quad, which is led by the United States, which includes Australia and Japan as well. And the goal of the Quad is to isolate and counter Chinese influence in Asia. I mean, if we look at India, it has very good relations with the United States, but at the same time, it didn't join the sanctions against Russia. So how would you characterize India's position in the SCO?
An incredible balancing act. This is an India which, is trying to thread the needle, strike a very fine balancing act, one. And at the same time, it's also, India's presence at the summit, its decision to go to Samarkand was, there were two drivers. One, of course, is that India is going to be the next chair of the next SCO. So I guess that was one driver. The other one is its need to project an independent foreign policy. It wants to assert that it's not necessarily in the U.S. Sphere of influence. It has very good relations with the U.S., but at the same time, it has historically strong ties with Russia, and we saw that. And it was this historicity of the ties and the comfort level that India has with Russia that probably enabled Prime Minister Modi to tell President Putin publicly that this is not an era of war. I can't imagine any other time India would have said this, could have said this, or would have said this. But that was a very assertive statement. And in fact, it was very striking that at this meeting, both India and China were pronouncedly against the war by Russia. I think President Xi also, expressed himself against war. So, in as much as India understands the Russian position and where it comes from, I don't think it hesitates to speak its mind. And yeah, I mean, it is a part of Quad. At the same time, it has repeatedly emphasized that it's not a part of a military alliance. Because the Quad is certainly not a military alliance, nor, for that matter, is SCO. It's very striking that within the SCO, many countries have problems with many other member countries. As one of the previous panelists pointed out, India and China have a problem with each other. India and Pakistan. It's a very strange organization, but the sense I got at the conclusion of the summit was a lot of it was driven by the economy. They all want, despite the tough times because of the war, they all want an economic progress. India went there arguing for transit rights. It wants, because there are many landlocked countries in this organization, it wants transit rights into Afghanistan, into Central Asia. Pakistan, of course, came there to emphasize the challenges it's facing because of global warming. every country came there with a different purpose. But the fact that they met at all is, I think, encouraging. The fact that India and China, despite all the tensions, still managed to meet. It was preceded a couple of days by the first disengagement on their border. So I think it was overall a very positive experience, and I think India managed to show that it is not necessarily in thrall of U.S. or under U.S. influence, that it has its own national security interests at heart when it attends such summit.
Sourabh, when we look at the SCO, when we look at its growth, are we seeing the emergence of two blocs in the world right now? You've got one bloc, led by the United States, which includes North America, the European Union states, also South Korea, Japan, and Israel, and then the other group, everybody else.
No, I wouldn't frame it as blocks. And this is where it goes down to what exactly the SCO is. The SCO is not an anti-Western body. It's not an anti-Western body. It's a non-Western body, at least so far. And as I said, there are many civilizational spaces which find utility in cooperating with each other. The SCO has, as it's been guided over the past 20 years, it had a defensive inclination, and that also, as I said, was to root out terrorism, separatism, extremism. Understand the context in which this happened 20 years ago. It was the time of 9/11. It was the unipolar moment, and in the post-Soviet space, there was a lot of ethnic separatism happening, and so that was the focus. But I think it's useful now on its 20th, or I think this is the 21st year, the importance of Samarkand. Samarkand was the heart of the Great Silk Road in a way. It is where all the corridors intersected. Samarkand did not see its connections with the world in a divisible way. It was indivisible when it looked out. The world wasn't fragmented, and the connections came from all directions. And there's an understanding, bearing in mind this defensive notion within the SCO, that we need to move now towards far greater economic cooperation. And that would, of course, involve connectivity corridors, but it also involves broader range of development-related indices, particularly in the area of digital cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. And so the goal is not to frame this against us versus them, as to build capacity. And as it keeps building capacity internally, we are seeing that it is becoming a pole of attraction. People want to sign up to the SCO, folks like Saudi Arabia, etc. And hopefully, as it just broadens itself out, perhaps even to African countries thereafter, as dialogue partners, etc., etc., the correct impression will be that this is not against anybody per se. It is to build cooperation internally and be an example of what a multipolar and a multilateral society can be, particularly given that they do have their problems internally, but yet can tide over them and find means of cooperation. So I wouldn't look at it as much in the bloc versus bloc context, because that is precisely what they're trying to move away from, and definitely don't want to give that impression to people, to outsiders. It may be non-Western so far, but it is not an anti-Western body.
Einar, what are your thoughts on how influential the SCO as an organization can be internationally, given that it is completely independent of any Western countries? And I mean, could it act as a counter to what the West wants? We know the West is always talking about a rules-based order, but it's the West's rules-based order, isn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, it's consensus over coercion. I mean, there was no talking about taking action against any country or, forcing other countries to do something. Basically, what you had was leaders who were talking to each other. It's, they look at each other and they talk about what their issues are. And it creates this kind of peer pressure. They're saying, look, if we're going to come together, we need economic development. We, of course, need to protect our internal countries from separatism, extremism, and terrorism. So, I mean, it's a very, very different, and I completely agree with my colleagues who said that this is not to be viewed in this same old way. I mean, the US wants to see this as bloc versus bloc. It really isn't, because there is no bloc. There's no one saying that this is the agenda, that we have the international rules order. But there is an attempt by China to adopt principles about internal security through this global security initiative. And this is not laying down the law and saying what countries have to do. It's talking about principles that countries should work together, basically respecting each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Dmitry Babich, President Putin came up with an idea which may or may not illustrate in a very graphic way the independence of an organization like the SCO. He has suggested the creation of major sports events under the banner of the SCO. And in fact, the Belarus president actually suggested that the years 2024 and 2026 is when these games could be held. Those are the same years in which the summer and winter Olympics are going to be held in Europe. What do you make of that idea and the kind of message that it will send?
Well, I think it's obvious where it came from. Even before the current sanctions, which in fact excluded the Russian athletes arbitrarily from international sports, from Western sports, there was, you know, this ugly story with Western media claiming that Russian athletes somehow used doping more than all the other athletes. And there were cases when athletes such as Elena Isimbayeva, who never failed her doping tests, she was not allowed to go to Rio. And she could not become one more time an Olympic champion, even though she had all the capabilities. The whole team of Russian Paralympic athletes, you know, the disabled athletes, they were not allowed to come. None of them was allowed to come to Rio. And later they had problems with coming to South Korea, to Pyeongchang. So it's clear that Putin wants, it's not just for Russia, it's for many countries of the world. We need to break this kind of, not monopoly, but obvious superiority of the United States and Europe in staging sports events. For example, I'm very glad that the next soccer World Cup will be taking place in Qatar. I remember how much effort, you know, the soccer officials had to put into finally moving this World Cup away from the European, you know, Latin American or North American territory. It was a great achievement that Qatar got this World Cup on its territory. In general, I would say that I agree with the previous speakers. It's not an anti-Western organization. It's a non-Western organization. And the same can be said about Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, that we have been having here on the territory of the former Soviet Union since 1992. If you go to any session of CSTO, the first phrase you read in the statement is that it is not directed against any other country.
Right.
And this is absolutely true. I mean, Russia cannot force Kazakhstan to go with it to war with Ukraine or with any other country. Russia cannot force Armenia or any other member of CSTO to participate in any foreign adventure. This is the case, unfortunately, with NATO. We have seen it in Afghanistan, we have seen it in Iraq, where the British went with Americans. So basically, I agree with the previous speaker. It's our blocs, it's not a bloc, these organizations, CSTO and SCO, they are not confrontational. And it's very interesting, CSTO for many years wanted to make some kind of agreement, you know, to develop ties with NATO. And NATO refused to notice CSTO. NATO and the Western media just boycott CSTO. They pretended it didn't exist. They first noticed it only in January this year, when CSTO used its forces to reestablish order in Kazakhstan after several government buildings were burned down there,
right,
and hundreds of people killed by the so-called peaceful demonstrators, as the Western media call them.
Okay.
And indeed, just to finish it very quickly, I agree with Sourabh Gupta that initially SCO was designed to fight terrorism. Terrorism is still not uprooted completely in Eurasia, but also the aim was to prevent conflict. To my mind, it's quite obvious that the United States is trying to stir the Muslim minority in China against the Chinese government. The United States and the EU obviously pitted Ukrainian nationalists against Russia.
Okay.
So CSTO wants to prevent it in Eurasia.
Yeah, I want to go to Chidanand. Chidanand, you know, as you pointed out earlier on, India takes over the presidency of the SCO and, in fact, will host the next SCO Summit. So India will be in the driver's seat. And where will India be steering the organization in the year ahead?
Look, the bottom line here is that in India, many Indian prime ministers, notably Mr. Vajpayee, has said that you cannot change your neighbors. You cannot, you can change everything else, but not your neighbors, not the borders. So the two predominant countries which affect India's foreign policy in many ways, China and Pakistan, they're neighbors, good or bad. We have to live with them. And so India being part of this organization is not surprising at all, although it's a China-led and China-driven organization. So I expect India to have an active role in this organization for years to come, decades to come, as long as it survives. It's also a fact that within the organization, like I pointed out, there are many countries with differences, internal differences between them.
Right.
And there are many countries with good ties with the United States. It's not just India, it's, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, many aspiring countries too have good relations. Yeah. So yeah, this is, I see this more as an AU rather than as an anti-NATO. I mean, there's a European Union, you add European Union and United States. This is a sort of Asian Union. It'll be primarily trade and commerce driven. Right. There are many commonalities, and these commonalities go back centuries. Everyone knows about the Silk Road. Beyond that, they want to build transit lines. Right. Many landlocked countries want access to the sea. So I primarily see this as a trading and a commerce organization.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and thank you for watching.